January 10, 1945. A destroyed French village called Hatton. One American soldier, rejected by the army for bad eyesight, deemed unfit for combat, reduced to cooking duties, now stands alone in the smoking ruins. His machine gun barrel glows cherry red in the darkness. Spent brass casings pile ankle-deep around his boots. Outside, in the frozen streets, lie the bodies of more than 40 German soldiers. He has been fighting without sleep for 48 hours. The Germans keep coming. His weapon keeps jamming. Artillery shells are tearing the buildings apart around him. He is completely surrounded. He has no food, no water, no hope of relief, and he refuses to leave. This is the story of how a coal miner from Illinois became a one-man fortress, and why the German Wehrmacht could not break him. The Alsace region of northeastern France has always been contested ground, a corridor of blood where empires collide. By January 1945, the villages scattered across this frost-hardened landscape had already changed hands multiple times during 5 years of war. Hatton was one such place, a cluster of stone houses, narrow streets, and a small church steeple that rose above snow-covered rooftops like a skeletal finger pointing toward an indifferent sky. Before the war, perhaps 200 people lived here. They grew grapes, kept chickens, rang the church bells on Sundays. Now, in the first weeks of the new year, Hatton was a corpse of a village, 90% destroyed, its buildings gutted by shellfire, its streets cratered and strewn with rubble. The smell of cordite and burned wood hung in the freezing air. Snow had fallen intermittently for days, covering the wreckage in a thin white shroud that did nothing to mask the underlying devastation. This was the edge of the Third Reich's death throes, but the beast still had teeth. Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front, had begun on New Year's Eve, a desperate attempt by Wehrmacht and SS forces to push the Americans back across the Rhine, to relieve pressure on the crumbling Eastern Front, to buy time for a regime that had already lost the war but refused to admit it. The offensive struck hard into the thinly defended American lines in Alsace. Towns fell. Entire battalions were encircled. The frozen ground trembled under the treads of German armor, and the night sky flickered with muzzle flashes and burning villages. Into this maelstrom came the men of the 42nd Infantry Division, the famed Rainbow Division, a unit with a storied history stretching back to the First World War. They had landed in France in December 1944, fresh from training in the States, and had been rushed into the line to shore up the collapsing front. Among them was Company A of the 242nd Infantry Regiment, and within that company was a soldier who had no business being there at all, a 37-year-old private first class named Vito Bertoldo. Bertoldo was not a natural soldier by anyone's measure. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, wiry and compact, with thick glasses perched on a hawkish nose and a face that seemed perpetually set in a scowl of skepticism. He had been born in Decatur, Illinois, in 1907, the son of Italian immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic in search of something better than the poverty of southern Italy. What they found was the grinding, dangerous labor of the American coal industry. By the time Vito was 14, he was following his father down into the mines, descending 600 feet below the surface of the earth into a world of darkness, dust, and the constant threat of death. The mines shaped him in ways that would prove critical decades later. 600 feet down, a man learned to sense things before he saw them. The mines were a sensory deprivation chamber where vision was reduced to the flickering cone of a carbide lamp, and survival depended on other faculties. Bertoldo learned to hear the groan of stressed timbers, the faint hiss of escaping gas, the distant rumble of a collapsing tunnel. He learned to feel vibrations through the soles of his boots, the approach of a coal cart, the rhythm of a distant drilling crew, the subtle tremor that meant the rock overhead was shifting. He learned to navigate in near-total darkness, to orient himself by the flow of air currents, to detect the presence of other men by the sound of their breathing or the displacement of dust in the still, underground air. The mines taught patience, too, the ability to work methodically in cramped, hellish conditions where panic meant death. And they taught something else, something harder to define. A stubborn, almost irrational refusal to yield to circumstances, because yielding underground often meant being buried alive. For more than 20 years, Bertoldo swung a pickaxe and pushed coal carts through the lightless tunnels beneath Illinois. He married, had children, lived the cramped, exhausting life of a working-class immigrant family during the Depression. When the war came, he tried to enlist immediately. America had been attacked, and Bertoldo, for all his rough edges, believed in paying his debts. But the army took one look at his thick glasses, tested his vision, and turned him away. His eyesight was too poor. He tried again, rejected again. The broken frames held together with wire probably didn't help his case. Finally, in 1942, with manpower needs growing desperate, the army lowered its standards and Bertoldo was accepted. He was 35 years old, ancient by infantry standards, and his eyes still weren't good, so they made him a cook. For 2 years, Vito Bertoldo peeled potatoes, stirred vats of stew, and endured the peculiar purgatory of being in the army but not really of it. He was restless, argumentative, prone to insubordination. The officers saw a discipline problem, a coal miner who didn't salute smartly and who talked back when he thought orders were stupid. They didn't see what the mines had made him. In December 1944, after months of persistent requests and outright demands, Bertoldo finally got his wish. He was reassigned to Company A, 242nd Infantry Regiment, as a rifleman. At 37, he was the oldest man in his squad by more than a decade. The young soldiers called him Pop, and wondered what the hell an old man with glasses was doing in a combat infantry company. They would find out soon enough. By early January 1945, the 42nd Division was dug in along a thinly held line in the Alsace region, trying to contain the German offensive. The weather was brutally cold, with nighttime temperatures plunging well below freezing. The men endured in foxholes and shattered buildings, subsisting on cold rations, trying to keep their weapons from freezing. The Germans were pressing hard, probing for weaknesses, and the American line was stretched dangerously thin. Intelligence reports indicated a major attack was imminent, but the exact time and place remained uncertain. On January 8, the blow fell on Hatton. The village was strategically important. It sat astride a key road junction that the Germans needed to continue their advance. The 242nd Infantry Regiment's command post had been established in one of the few intact buildings near the center of the ruined village, a 2-story stone structure that had once been a small municipal office. The battalion staff, officers, radiomen, clerks, worked out of this building, coordinating the defense. Security was minimal. Most of the available manpower was committed to the front lines, and the command post was supposed to be safely behind friendly lines. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. On the evening of January 8th, forward observers reported German armor and infantry massing to the north. By midnight, the thunder of artillery had intensified, and shortly after 0300 hours on January 9th, radio reports confirmed the worst. A major German assault force had broken through the American positions and was advancing directly toward Hatton. The command post was about to be overrun. The battalion commander faced an impossible choice. If the staff stayed, they would be killed or captured, and the entire regiment would lose its command and control capability. But if they evacuated, they would be abandoning their positions, exposing the entire sector to collapse. Someone would need to stay behind and delay the German advance long enough for the staff to get clear and for reinforcements to be brought up. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. Vito Bertoldo had been assigned to command post security detail, a relatively quiet job for a new infantryman. When the order came to evacuate, Bertoldo stepped forward without hesitation. He would stay. He would cover the withdrawal. He was told, quite explicitly, that this was almost certainly a death sentence. Bertoldo shrugged. Someone had to do it, and he was old anyway. Let the young men live. They left him with a Browning M1919A4 machine gun, several cans of .30-06 ammunition, a handful of grenades, and a canteen that would freeze solid before dawn. The battalion staff evacuated into the darkness, moving south toward friendly lines, and Vito Bertoldo was left alone in the ruins of Hatton with a machine gun and his mining-sharpened senses. The cold was vicious, a bone-deep chill that made every breath painful and turned exposed skin numb within minutes. Bertoldo set up his machine gun on the ground floor of the command post building, positioning it to cover the main road leading into the village from the north. The M1919A4 was a formidable weapon, a belt-fed, air-cooled machine gun that fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge at a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. It weighed 31 pounds without the tripod, and its effective range exceeded 1,000 yards. In trained hands, it could shred an infantry assault or disable light vehicles. But it was also temperamental. The air-cooled barrel could overheat rapidly during sustained fire, causing jams and malfunctions. And at 31 pounds, it was brutally heavy to move under fire. Bertoldo settled in behind the weapon and waited. The darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness he knew from the mines. A living, pressing thing that swallowed light and muffled sound. He could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional crack of rifle fire from the east, and then, slowly, something closer. The creak of heavy machinery, the low growl of diesel engines, the metallic clink of infantry equipment. The Germans were coming. His mining instincts took over. He closed his eyes and listened. 600 feet underground, you learned to interpret sounds with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. The rumble of engines told him tracked vehicles, probably half-tracks, at least 3 or 4 of them. The rhythm of footfalls, a lot of men moving in formation, 50 or more. The displacement of air and the faint echo off ruined buildings told him the column was perhaps 200 yards away and closing. He kept his hands on the machine gun but did not fire. Not yet. Wait. Let them come closer. Make the first burst count. The sound grew louder. He could hear individual voices now, German voices, low and tense. Orders being given. The screech of brakes as the vehicles slowed. The cough of idling engines. Bertoldo opened his eyes and peered into the darkness. He could just make out the vague shapes of vehicles, darker shadows against the black sky, rolling into the street perhaps 15 to 20 meters from his position. They had stopped. Infantry was dismounting. They were that close. Bertoldo's finger tightened on the trigger. He aimed for the mass of movement where the infantry was clustered around the vehicles. And then he fired. The Browning roared to life, a sustained, deafening bellow that shattered the frozen silence. The muzzle flash lit up the street in a strobing nightmare of orange light and shadow. The barrel traversed smoothly, Bertoldo working the gun with the methodical precision of a man who had spent decades working heavy machinery. The 6-second burst poured over 100 rounds into the German formation at point-blank range. The effect was catastrophic. Men fell in heaps. The .30-06 rounds, each one capable of punching through a helmet or body armor at close range, tore through the packed infantry with horrific efficiency. Screams erupted. The Germans scattered, diving for cover behind the vehicles, into doorways, anywhere away from the fire. Bertoldo released the trigger and listened. Groaning, shouting, the clatter of equipment as men tried to reorganize. He had killed at least 8, probably more, in that single burst. And now they knew he was here. The Germans opened fire, rifles and submachine guns spitting toward his position. Bullets smacked into the stone walls of the building, throwing up chips of rock and dust. Bertoldo kept low, peering through the gun sights, waiting for another target. A group of Germans tried to advance up the left side of the street, using a low stone wall for cover. He traversed the gun and fired a shorter burst, 3 seconds, 50 rounds. The men behind the wall crumpled. Another group tried to flank right. Same result. The battle settled into a grim rhythm. The Germans would mass for an assault, and Bertoldo would cut them down. They tried smoke grenades, but the wind scattered the smoke too quickly. They tried suppressive fire, but Bertoldo simply ducked below the window line and waited for them to expose themselves. The M1919A4 became an extension of his body, a tool wielded with the same unconscious skill he had once applied to a pickaxe. The belt fed smoothly through the receiver. The barrel grew hot, then very hot, then began to glow a dull red in the darkness. Bertoldo kept firing. The spent brass casings ejected in a glittering stream, piling up around his boots. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that filled the ruined building and echoed off the surrounding walls. The smell of burned powder was thick and acrid, mixing with the cold air and the stench of blood from the street outside.
Bertoldo s'y rend.
His hands were numb from the cold and the vibration of the gun. But he kept firing. As the hours passed, the German attacks intensified. They brought up more troops, more vehicles. The half-tracks disgorged wave after wave of infantry. Bertoldo mowed them down. The bodies in the street began to pile up, forming a grotesque barricade of the dead and dying. The Germans tried to recover their wounded, and Bertoldo killed the medics too. There was no mercy here, no chivalry. This was survival, pure and brutal. Sometime around 0600 hours, the sky began to lighten. Dawn came slowly in January, a grudging shift from black to gray. As visibility increased, Bertoldo's situation became horrifically clear. The street outside was carpeted with German dead. But beyond them, stretching back along the road, were hundreds more soldiers, supported by armored vehicles, half-tracks, and at least 2 tanks. Panzer IVs by the look of them, 75mm guns and thick frontal armor. The Germans had committed a major force to taking Hatton, and all that stood between them and a complete breakthrough was one man with a machine gun. The tanks opened fire. The flat crack of the 75mm guns was followed instantly by the screaming roar of high-explosive shells impacting the building. The first round hit the upper floor, blowing out the wall and sending a cascade of rubble down into the street. The concussion was immense, a physical blow that slammed into Bertoldo and left his ears ringing even more loudly. He grabbed the machine gun and its ammunition and moved. The M1919 A4 weighed 31 pounds. The tripod added another 14. Each ammunition can held 250 rounds and weighed about 15 pounds. Bertoldo was hauling over 60 pounds of gear while under direct fire from tanks and infantry. He dragged the equipment out the back of the command post building and across the street into what had once been a bakery. The structure was half collapsed, but the thick stone walls were still intact on 2 sides, and there were several windows facing north. It would do. He set up the gun in a window on the ground floor and opened fire again. The Germans, who had been massing for another assault, were caught in the open. Bertoldo traversed the gun back and forth, firing in controlled bursts, cutting them down as they scrambled for cover. The barrel was glowing bright red now, heat radiating off it in shimmering waves despite the freezing air. He could smell the metal heating, could see the slight distortion in the barrel from the thermal stress. A jam now would be fatal. It jammed. The belt stopped feeding, and the gun fell silent. Bertoldo's hands moved with practiced speed, clearing the malfunction, extracting the jammed round, reseating the belt. 18 seconds. Felt like an eternity. German bullets smacked into the window frame around him. He ducked, finished clearing the jam, and resumed firing. The gun roared back to life. The Germans brought up mortars. Bertoldo heard the distinctive hollow thump of mortar rounds leaving their tubes, a sound that gave you perhaps 3 seconds to react before the shell arrived. He dove away from the window as the first round impacted, exploding in the street outside and sending shrapnel screaming through the building. Another round hit the upper floor. Then another. The building shuddered under the impacts. Bertoldo's mining instincts kicked in again. Underground, you learned to predict where a collapse would occur by the pattern of small failures. A crack here, a shift there, the sound of stressed rock beginning to fail. Mortars followed predictable patterns too. The crews would adjust fire, walking the rounds toward the target, and if you paid attention, you could predict where the next shell would land. Bertoldo moved before the rounds arrived, repositioning to different windows, firing a burst, then moving again before the mortars could adjust. He was fighting the entire German assault force with the tactics of a coal miner dodging a tunnel collapse. The hours ground on. The sun climbed higher, though the sky remained overcast and gray. Bertoldo had no food, no water. His canteen had frozen solid. His ammunition was running low, he was down to 2 cans, 500 rounds. He was exhausted, his body running on adrenaline and sheer stubbornness. But he kept fighting. The Germans, frustrated and taking horrific casualties, brought up their heavy weapon. A self-propelled 88mm gun, one of the most feared weapons in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. The 88 could penetrate any Allied tank at range and could reduce a building to rubble with just a few rounds. Bertoldo saw the long barrel traverse toward his position, saw the muzzle flash, and then the world exploded. The 88mm shell hit the bakery at ground level, penetrating the stone wall and detonating inside. The explosion was cataclysmic. The pressure wave picked Bertoldo up and hurled him across the room like a rag doll. He slammed into the far wall and crumpled to the floor, stunned, ears ringing, vision blurred. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking him. He could taste blood in his mouth, feel the warm trickle of it running down his face. His machine gun lay on the floor 10 feet away. The barrel bent, the receiver smashed. It was done. The M1919A4 that had killed dozens of Germans, that had held off an entire assault force for more than 12 hours, was now a useless hunk of twisted metal. Bertoldo dragged himself to his feet. His body screamed in protest. Bruised ribs, possibly cracked, lacerations on his face and hands. The deep, bone-aching exhaustion of a man who had been fighting without rest for more than a day. But he was not done. He grabbed his rifle, an M1 Garand, checked the clip, and moved to a new position. The Germans were advancing again, confident now that the machine gun was silent. Infantry moved up the street in a skirmish line, weapons at the ready. Bertoldo let them come close, then opened fire with the Garand. The semi-automatic rifle cracked steadily, 8 rounds in rapid succession. Then the distinctive ping as the empty clip ejected. He reloaded, fired again. The Germans dove for cover, their advance stalling. Bertoldo grabbed a white phosphorus grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and hurled it into the street. The grenade detonated with a sharp crack, and burning white phosphorus sprayed across the German position. Men screamed, their uniforms and flesh igniting, and the assault broke. He fell back deeper into the ruins, moving from building to building, firing, throwing grenades, using every scrap of cover. The Germans pursued, but cautiously now, unwilling to charge blindly into the rubble where this insane American seemed to be everywhere at once. Bertoldo was bleeding, exhausted, half-deaf from the explosions, but he was still fighting. Every minute he delayed them was another minute for the battalion staff to get clear, another minute for reinforcements to arrive. The second night fell, and Bertoldo found himself in the cellar of a destroyed house. His rifle almost out of ammunition, his grenades expended. He had lost track of time. His body felt like it was shutting down, muscles trembling with exhaustion, vision blurring. He thought about the mines, about the times he had been trapped underground when a tunnel collapsed, waiting in the darkness for rescue, wondering if it would come. This was the same, except the tunnel was a ruined French village, and the weight pressing down on him was an entire German army. He must have passed out at some point because the next thing he knew, he heard voices, American voices, speaking English with a familiar Midwestern accent. He tried to respond, but his voice came out as a croak. Hands lifted him, gentle but firm. Medics. He tried to tell them about the Germans, about the need to hold the position, but the words wouldn't come. Someone pressed a canteen to his lips, and he drank, the water painful on his torn throat. They carried him out of the ruins and into the pale light of January 10th. He saw his Company A, back in Hatton in force with tank support and artillery. The village was secure. The German assault had been stopped, and scattered throughout the streets and buildings were the bodies, German bodies, dozens of them, perhaps more. The officers tried to count, but the numbers were confused in the chaos of battle. Battalion records would later suggest 60 to 80 German dead, though the confirmed count was at least 40. All killed by one man over the course of 48 hours. Bertoldo was evacuated to a field hospital. The doctors found him covered in blood, soot, and gunpowder residue, with multiple lacerations, bruised ribs, partial hearing loss, and severe exhaustion. He had been clutching the destroyed machine gun when they found him, even though it was useless. They had to pry it from his hands. The battalion commander filed a report. The officers who had evacuated the command post filed statements. The men who had retaken Hatton and seen the carnage filed their own accounts. The paperwork moved up the chain of command, slowly, through the bureaucracy of a massive army fighting a war on multiple continents. Months passed. The war in Europe ended. Vito Bertoldo went back to his unit, still a private first class, still the old man with glasses who nobody quite knew what to make of. Then, on August 28, 1945, the official notification arrived. Private First Class Vito Bertoldo was to be awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, for his actions at Hatton on January 9 and 10, 1945. The citation read, in part, "He voluntarily remained behind to cover the withdrawal of the command post. His resolute defense prevented the enemy from overrunning the command post. His actions saved the lives of 517 men." The medal was presented by President Harry S. Truman at the White House on a bright day in the autumn of 1945. Bertoldo stood at attention, still uncomfortable in his dress uniform, still squinting through his thick glasses, still looking more like a coal miner than a war hero. Truman draped the medal around his neck and shook his hand. Photographers snapped pictures. Officers saluted. And Vito Bertoldo, who had spent most of his life 600 feet underground swinging a pickaxe, who had been rejected by the army for bad eyesight, who had been considered a discipline problem and relegated to cooking duties, who had finally gotten his chance to fight and had done something almost incomprehensibly brave, simply nodded and said thank you. He returned to Decatur after the war, back to his wife and children, back to a life that tried to be normal but never quite could be again. The mines were still there, but Bertoldo never went back underground. He worked above ground for the rest of his life, in factories and shops, quiet jobs that didn't involve darkness or the sound of gunfire or the smell of burning phosphorus. He didn't talk much about Hatton. When asked, he would shrug and say he was just doing his job, that anyone would have done the same, that he was no hero. But his eyes, those bad eyes that had almost kept him out of the army entirely, told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something most people never see, who had stood alone against an army and refused to break. Vito Bertoldo died in 1966 at the age of 59, his lungs ruined by decades of coal dust, and his hearing permanently damaged by 48 hours of continuous gunfire. He was buried in Decatur with full military honors, the Medal of Honor resting on his chest. The men of the 242nd Infantry Regiment who survived the war, and there were 517 of them who owed their lives to Bertoldo's stand, came to the funeral. They stood in the cold Illinois wind and saluted as the coffin was lowered into the ground. And they remembered the old coal miner who had become a one-man fortress and held the line when everyone else had run. In the Alsace region of France, the village of Hatton was rebuilt after the war. The church steeple was restored, the houses reconstructed, and life returned to the narrow streets where Vito Bertoldo once stood alone against an army. There is a small plaque now, mounted on the wall of what used to be the battalion command post, commemorating the battle. The inscription is in French and English, and it tells the story briefly, inadequately, because no plaque can really capture what happened there. How one man, rejected and underestimated and dismissed, held off hundreds of enemy soldiers for 2 days without relief, without hope, without any expectation of survival. How the skills learned in the darkness 600 feet underground, the ability to sense movement by sound and vibration, to navigate in total blackness, to remain calm when the world was collapsing, saved 517 lives and stopped a German offensive in its tracks. The story of Vito Bertoldo is a story about the hidden strengths that people carry, about how the grinding, unglamorous labor of ordinary life can forge something extraordinary when the moment demands it. It is a story about courage, but not the kind of courage that announces itself loudly. It is the quiet, stubborn courage of a man who simply refused to quit, who did what needed to be done because someone had to do it, and who asked for nothing in return except the chance to do his job properly. In the hierarchy of battlefield heroism, there are those who charge into fire and those who hold the line. Bertoldo held the line. For 48 hours in the frozen ruins of Hatton, with a glowing red barrel and ankle-deep brass casings and the dead piling up in the streets, he held the line. And the line did not break. If the story moved you, if you believe that the courage of ordinary people deserves to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you these forgotten stories of heroism. Hit the like button to help this reach others who need to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what do you think gave Bertoldo the strength to stand alone when everyone else had retreated? Was it his mining background, his stubbornness, or something else entirely? Let's discuss.